Yes, very good morning to all present here. It's my very honor and great privilege to have an eminent speaker, Dr. Sushant, for this occasion. And on behalf of Wing Research Community and on behalf of Vidyavardhaka College of Engineering, Mysuru, India, heartily welcome for this webinar, ma'am. And also, I would like to welcome all the participants for this webinar. And I would like to welcome beloved principal and also HOD on the in their absence. I'll hand over this to Mr. Goutham, who will introduce the speaker of the day.
Very good morning, ma'am. Today I'm Goutham B, Assistant Professor, Vidyavardhaka College of Engineering. I'm going to introduce the guest. Dr. Sushant is an independent consultant, speaker, and a teacher focused on cultivating learning-centric teaching in higher education. Her disciplinary interest includes online teaching, STEM education, and instructional design. Sushant's background includes keynote address and workshops in Czech Republic, Austria, Costa Rica, Estonia, Cyprus, England, Portugal, China, Germany, and throughout the United States. She has had a full bright appointments and has 25 years of experience in higher education, including teaching, curriculum design, faculty development, and administration. She is an IEEE distinguished lecturer, co-author of Teaching and Learning in Distance and background of Dunis, as well as numerous articles on topics such as course design, remote labs, and higher order thinking. Madam is a new member of ACM and appreciates the many benefits available for professional development and networking. Her professional service activities include reviewing proposal for NSF, serving as a co-chair for International Conference of Computer-Supported Education, chairing the higher order thinking work for International Society of Education Pedagogy, and reviewing proposal paper for IEEE TAIL, EDICON, and Intelligence System, TMC, Europe. Thank you. We welcome you.
Thank you. So shall I jump right in and get started?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Please go ahead.
Okay. Well, thank you for inviting me, and that was a wonderful introduction. So I'm sitting at my office, in my office at home, and my dog is outside the door barking. So I hope that doesn't distract anyone. I think she's going to go to bed pretty quickly now because it's evening time for me. So yes, my background is in educational technology and online learning, but my primary focus is related to the issues about teaching and learning within those areas. So today what I want to talk to you about is this idea of how digital natives are really what we would consider an educational myth. And I'm going to talk about a few other mythical beasts as well. So let me see if I can get my PowerPoint. There we go. So, you know, we see these sort of news stories and, you know, we might think, well, you know, these are obviously, you know, not right. Or some of them, you know, we might think, yeah, this could be true. So the idea of that you can unlock your car door with a tennis ball, while that sounds okay if you've locked your keys out of your car, in fact, that doesn't work. But it was sort of all over the internet a few years ago. I was seeing it on Facebook, and I think I saw it on Twitter. And every now and then it pops up again. The example below that about United Airlines, this is actually a phishing attempt that appeared on Facebook, saying that, you know, United Airlines was going to give away tickets. That's obviously, well, semi-obviously, a hoax or a scam. One of my favorite ones is that book that's the picture in the middle about instant learning. And honestly, I keep saying I'm going to order that book just to see what what they say, because I would love to learn several languages instantly. There's another story there that that says we now have a shorter attention span than a goldfish. Well, that might sound possibly plausible, but in fact, it's not true. But the headline certainly grabs you and pulls you in. And then finally, the story about the weight of all the ants on Earth is about the same as the weight of all the people. That's also not true, although it certainly seems possible. So what I want to talk about today, though, are ideas or theories or models that have been put forward that actually sound like they could be true. But I'll be describing in what ways and why those things aren't true. So let's jump right into our main topic, according to the title, and that is digital natives. Now, in about 2001, a man named Mark Prensky began to write articles and books about a group of people he referred to as digital natives. Now, digital natives are those people typically who were born in the early 1980s, who've grown up surrounded by computers and other forms of technology. And Prensky's idea was that because they have grown up surrounded by all this technology, that in fact they've sort of just absorbed that, and that they are innately tech savvy. What we know is that in fact that's not true. But he went on to say more than just, they were tech savvy. He went on to say that, in fact, because of this, that these young people, well, at that point, young people, because of this, that they actually think and process information fundamentally differently from their predecessors. And I want to really focus on that. They process information fundamentally differently. Now, they don't, okay? This doesn't happen that way. And in fact, there is absolutely no evidence for this. And to say that simply being around technology changes the way your brain works, if I say it like that, then suddenly, it becomes much more obvious that this is probably not true. But as Prensky was writing, he was using sort of vague terms in many cases and pronouncements that sounded like they could be true. So when he talked about digital natives, he said they're native speakers of technology and they're fluent in the digital language of computers, video games, and the internet. Well, no, they aren't really. Okay. Now, what's especially interesting is that he was writing about this in the early to mid 2000s. So I think his first publication where he discussed and really coined this term digital natives, that was in about 2001. And later writings around, say, 2006 to 2008, he was saying these same things, that these young people who had grown up surrounded by technology, in fact, had all sorts of capabilities, and they were fluent in this digital language and were very tech savvy. Now, today we might think, well, we could assume some young people are tech savvy. The problem here, though, is that this was really early in the sort of internet world. I mean, if you think back, 2001 was yeah, the internet was around and people were doing email and, you know, all sorts of other things. But in fact, it was nothing like today. And so for him to make these statements, it really caught a lot of attention from people. Now, part of the problem, however, is that when he wrote the books, most people did not realize that, in fact, these were just his opinions. And it was maybe sort of like wishful thinking. But in fact, nothing in his books was actually based on research. It was not based on any kind of evidence. He looked around and said, well, I'm seeing that some kids really like technology and they seem to be really good at it. But it was a tiny little group. So this idea of the digital native really stuck in people's minds because it was a shorthand way of referring to this group of students who really liked technology and in many cases did seem to have some pretty extraordinary abilities about technology. What's interesting though is that if you now do a Google search for digital native, these are the stories that come up. So the digital native is a myth. There are no digital natives. People who might have been referred to as digital natives in the past, in fact, don't have good technology skills. And so what we're seeing now is that people have caught on and they've said, you know, Mark Prensky's ideas might have been very interesting, you know, 15, almost 20 years ago. But in fact, what we now know is that this is really not a valid argument because these news stories about how there's really no such thing as a digital native, these are actually based on research, unlike Prensky's early writings. So the weird thing is that even though these are the news stories that come up, if you actually do a Google search, we're still hearing about digital natives. I just read a study the other day, and I want to look at my notes because I want to make sure I get these figures right. In 2018, there was a study that included 42,000 kids, and this is actually a test or a survey that's given in multiple countries. I think there were like 15 countries. So 42,000 kids all around the age of 14. And now remember, this is just 2 years ago, okay? These kids, only 19% of those kids had technology skills that were good enough that they could in fact work independently with the computer to do an accurate search for information or to use productivity tools effectively. Now let me repeat that, 19%, okay? So if these alleged digital natives, you know, who in fact the 14-year-olds now have really been immersed in this, you know, sort of digital world. So if only 19% of that group has anything approaching what we would consider someone who's tech savvy, then what in the world were the students like 15 years ago when this idea was just coming up? Now, another thing is that many students will, you know, they've completely bought into this idea that they are digital natives. And so very often, when you simply ask students to self-report about their technology skills, they will in fact report that they have pretty good skills. But when they're actually quizzed on that, given a test or a task to demonstrate that, in fact, they run into a lot of problems. So why does this matter? When someone believes in these myths, it can influence funding and policy decisions. What happened was that many school administrators said, well, you know, I've been reading about these digital natives, and, you know, I don't know if we really need to invest in any more computer training for these kids because they already have all these skills. And I really liked an article that Jathan Sadovsky wrote, and I love the title of it, actually. And the quote there comes from this article, but the title of the article was "The Digital Native, a Profitable Myth," because his argument is that when Prensky and his colleague, Don Tapscott, were promoting this idea of digital natives, they focused on a very small group of technically adept kids. And what that meant was they, as he says, they helped to line the pockets of ed tech consultants, so people who would come in and, you know, explain to a school, you know, what kind of equipment they needed and what kind of teaching they should be doing. And the other part of this was that decisions about things like, as I said, computer training, how to keep yourself safe online, how to protect your privacy online, in many cases, because this idea that, well, students are, you know, already very tech savvy, the decision was made that, in fact, we don't need to teach them these things. Now, you notice that the quote that I have there, and I wanted to say this is false right off the bat, but this comes from Don Tapscott, whose book, Grown Up Digital, came out in 2008. And he said the net generation, which is what he called this group, the net generation knows to be skeptical whenever they're online. Now, this isn't true today, and I can tell you that it definitely wasn't true in 2008. So this whole idea of, you know, we might initially say, well, but so, you know, so what? People think the students are technically adept and they're not. There are actual decisions that are being made based on this belief that, in fact, are damaging. Now, that little graphic that I have there on the slide, where it says, you know, self-assessed technology skills. So when you self-assess and say, I have very strong technology skills, so that's your own opinion. When that's high, what is low is that your sense of skepticism about technology is very low. So if I think I have really good technology skills, I'm not going to be very skeptical. And in fact, I'm also not going to ask for help about technology when I need it. Now, this is sort of related to the idea of the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is that, you know, when we think we know something, if we are actually somewhat ignorant, we rate ourselves as knowing more than we think we do. It's when we actually learn about a particular topic that we begin to recognize how little we actually know. Well, it's similar here, that these students who would say, yes, I'm very technologically adept, I'm very tech savvy, in fact, their level of skepticism was very low. And that might seem counterintuitive, but if you think about it, if a student feels like they sort of have a handle on this, I know what I'm doing, right? That they probably are not going to ask for help, but they also are not going to question what they see online. So it's actually a little bit counterintuitive, because you would think, well, someone who's very tech savvy, in fact, would question what they see. In fact, that is not what happens. So believing in this myth of the digital native, in fact, is very problematic. So let's move on and talk about our next myth, and that is multitaskers. Now, I wanted to talk about this immediately after talking about digital natives, because many times digital natives are considered to be very good multitaskers. And in fact, both Prensky and Tapscott refer to that as, you know, that these digital natives, this net gen group, are very good at multitasking. So what that is actually is when it appears that I'm doing two or more things at the same time. Now, you might say, well, you know, I can walk around and chew gum at the same time, right? But in fact, the tasks that we're referring to are tasks that require effort and that require concentration. And so many times you'll see examples of students who they are attempting to study, but they have their telephone with them. They maybe have a tablet that's open to, you know, who knows, Facebook or TikTok or Twitter or Instagram, or maybe all of those things. And so what we find there is that, in fact, we are not doing multiple things at the same time. In fact, what's going on is that we are doing what's called context switching. So we're paying attention to one task, and then we switch and we pay attention to something else. And then we go back and we pay attention to that. And so we end up doing this switching back and forth. What looks like parallel processing by our brain, in fact, is not. Now, we can switch very quickly back and forth, but that actual switching of taking attention away from a task and focusing it on something else, and then switching back and continuing to do this, in fact, has some pretty serious consequences. So the things that we know about multitasking is that when we try to do this, and by the way, I should say that, in fact, nobody is good at this. You know, we often hear people say, oh, you know, someone's a really good multitasker. Well, in fact, no one is a good multitasker. I'm not, you're not, your students are not. Okay, so why this matters? Well, multitasking causes anxiety. What we see from the research is that people who are required to switch their attention back and forth from one task to another, their anxiety levels go up. For students, this is a serious problem. So we already have an issue with student concentration if they are, you know, trying to do too many things at once. But then the anxiety that this multitasking causes adds another layer of cognitive activity, and can in fact cause sort of an overload. We talk about cognitive load in terms of how much sort of mental energy we have to spend on tasks. Anxiety adds to that. So anxiety is considered an element of cognitive load. Now, multitasking also interferes with working memory. Your working memory is that part of your brain that when you say I'm thinking about something right now, that's your working memory. It's sort of like when you put something on your computer, when you put it on the clipboard, right? So you can manipulate it, that's your working memory. So the working memory then, if is now required to work on this task and then pay attention to that one and then pay attention to something else, in fact, what that does is it slows down your ability to manipulate information in that working memory area. Now, not too surprisingly, multitasking also results in more mistakes. So trying to pay attention to many things, you know, we might think, well, this is more efficient because I can work on 3 things at once. In fact, it's extremely inefficient because of that switching, and it's inefficient because we make more mistakes. So again, as I said, this is a serious concern for our students, and we now have a significant body of research about multitasking and how it influences our learning. So multitasking has been shown to negatively affect students' study habits. That's not too surprising when you think about that. It actually has a negative effect on your learning. It negatively affects your grades and your overall GPA as well. Now, I have a note here that says multitasking, especially with technology devices, has these negative effects. The reason that we have found that tech devices in particular are sort of worse for multitasking is because of the sort of always on nature of those devices. So if I'm texting with 3 of my friends and I'm also trying to study, in fact, that idea of, or that process of texting means that I have to sort of always be available. And we talk about this idea of always being interruptible. And, you know, how this can get in the way of deep concentration. And so these ideas of attempting to multitask when in fact we're not working on multiple things at once, but we are hopping back and forth mentally, is especially bad when we are doing that with tech devices, as I said, because of that sort of always on and interruptible nature of those devices. Okay, so let's talk about our next big myth. And this myth it has been around for decades and decades and decades, but there is no evidence for this. So people talk about, I'm a visual learner, right? They have a visual learning style. What that means is that they prefer visual stimuli when they are learning. Now, the proponents of learning styles believe that this influences how a learner perceives and understands and stores information. In fact, that's not true. If we talk about learning styles in terms of preferences, in fact, we all have those preferences. And, you know, just an example from myself, I really do not like to watch videos to learn something. Now, I also know that sometimes that's the best way for me to learn something. So I try to remember that when I'm trying to learn something new, rather than immediately say, I do not want to watch a video. You know, just give me written instructions. I do not want to watch a video. But I have to recognize that sometimes that's the best way to learn. So we all have these preferences. There's no question about that. And typically, the preferences are abbreviated VARK. So this stands for visual, auditory, reading, and kinesthetic. So in other words, touching things as a way to learn about them. So there are a lot of questions about this idea of learning styles, but I want to jump to this idea of why it matters. So first of all, there's no evidence that these learning styles exist. We know everyone has preferences. That's not the argument. Okay, yes, some people prefer to look at pictures, some people prefer to listen to an audio stimulus, some people would rather read to learn. That's not a question. But there is no evidence that that preference, in fact, makes a difference in terms of how much you learn, how well you learn, how you store that information, or how you actually retrieve and manipulate that information. There's also no evidence that matching your instruction to your students' preferred style or preferred kind of stimulus improves learning. Now, this is an area where a lot of people will tell me, but I know my students do better, you know, when I match their learning styles. Well, there is no evidence of that whatsoever. In fact, there is evidence saying that doesn't happen. It's not just that we haven't found evidence that it does. There's evidence that it doesn't happen. So it matters because of those ideas. However, the bigger question for me is that when we do this, when we believe in this, and when we refer to our students, oh, maybe you're a visual learner. In fact, what we're doing is we are labeling our students. Oh, you're a certain type of learner. Sometimes, so I know a lot of instructors will have their students take sort of like a little learning styles quiz that allegedly identifies whether you're a visual learner, an auditory learner, whatever. And I really discourage that, because then what we're doing is we're encouraging our students to label themselves. Now, you might think, well, you know, so what if they label themselves as a visual learner, right? What's the problem there? The problem is that we want our students to develop what's called a growth mindset. Now, a growth mindset means that we don't, it's sort of hard to explain this in a positive way, because so often we talk about the growth mindset in terms of what it is not. A growth mindset says intelligence is not a fixed quantity, and a growth mindset says I have the ability to learn in multiple ways. A fixed mindset, on the other hand, says my ability to learn is limited. And we often see this with students who might say, I'm just not a math person. I've never been able to learn math. That's a perfect example of a fixed mindset. So these labels of, oh, you're a visual learner, can be limiting. And I'm not sure that we want to encourage students to put those limits on themselves. And I certainly don't want to label them myself and say, oh, well, you're this kind of learner. In other words, let's say you're a visual learner, or maybe you're an auditory learner. Okay. What I'm saying is that you, as a learner, are limited in how you learn and in the adaptability that you might have. So the bigger question about learning styles is not, you know, gee, should people be researching this or not? I don't think they should, but the biggest question is, what is this doing in terms of discouraging them from having this growth mindset? Now, you know, I mentioned that, you know, should people be engaging in research about this? To be honest, we already know that learning styles, in terms of their effect on how well we learn or how much we learn, that it's completely irrelevant. You know, it's sort of like saying, well, you know, the students who, you know, have green eyes are better at learning this, and the students who have brown eyes are better at learning that. It has nothing to do with that. But unfortunately, there is so much research going on about this topic. If you, even just on Google, you know, say learning styles and, well, learning styles and mechanical engineering education, okay, there will be so many studies about that. Well, okay, maybe that's a study that, you know, it gets you a publication. But wouldn't it make sense to be doing research on something that is actually a valuable contribution to what we are learning about how learning happens? So this is my official discouragement. Don't do this research. Do research that can actually contribute to our body of knowledge about how learning happens. So can you tell that I'm kind of passionate about this? Yeah. So please don't talk about learning styles with your students. Okay, let's move on. Oh, I bet some of you, many of you, have probably seen this learning pyramid. There are all sorts of versions of this. This is a typical one where the idea here is that we have this model, and each of these levels represents how much students will remember based on the kind of instructional strategy. So after 2 weeks, they will learn 5% of, or they will remember 5% of what they heard in a lecture. Okay, they will remember 10% of what they read. They will remember 20% of what, when this originally came out, it was called audiovisual. So 20% of that, which we could think of as probably like videos. So, and you see these percentages going down, 30% for demonstration. And this is that someone else is doing the demonstration and they're watching. 50% for discussions, and on we go. Now, this pyramid has a very interesting history. This has actually been around for a very long time, many decades again. And there is, here we go again, there is no evidence to suggest that this is true. These percentages are completely made up out of someone's head. Okay, and actually, you can probably tell that simply by looking at it. Like, what are the odds that it would come out so cleanly? 5%, 10, 20, 30. That would never happen like that. Okay, even rounded off. Okay, okay. So this idea that, you know, we can look at a kind of instructional strategy and say, well, students are only going to remember 20% of that in 2 weeks. In fact, this is totally untrue. And often when you see these, it will also include that little tagline down at the bottom where it says, this is from the National Training Laboratories in Bethel, Maine. So there have been people who've tried to track this down, and they've called up this National Training Laboratory. And in fact, no one seems to know where this came from. Apparently there was, someone who came up with these figures many decades ago, and it got included in an article. And so it kind of just became part of the lore. It just sort of became accepted that this in fact would happen, that students would remember, the least from lecture, a lot more from discussion. They learn the most by teaching something to someone else. And, in a way, you look at this, and again, this looks like this could make sense, right? It looks like it could be real, because aren't educators always saying students need to be more engaged, they need to be more active in their learning? And if you go down that list, in fact, you see that they do become more active in terms of the strategies. So, a discussion is much more active and engaging than simply listening to a lecture. But to say that a discussion is always better and that students will always remember more from that is not true at all. Okay, so why does this matter? Well, this model suggests that teachers should avoid some types of instruction, such as lecture, regardless of the desired learning outcomes for their students. So if you look at that model, it's going to suggest that you avoid lectures and you move toward things like discussions and active kinds of learning. But in fact, lecture might be an excellent instructional strategy for some content and some desired learning outcomes. The other problem is this encourages instructors to implement what are potentially ineffective learning strategies. So it's sort of the flip side of that, of my first point. And here it's saying, look, you shouldn't just avoid lecturing, but you should always try to have students, not just reading, but engaging in a discussion or teaching someone else, etc. Okay, those might be ineffective learning strategies, depending on the content, depending on the students, depending on the desired learning. And then finally, the part that I really don't like about it is that it promotes a very simplistic idea of the kind of knowledge retention. I have to do little bunny ears here. This idea of knowledge retention is a very simplistic idea of memory and the kind of remembering that we would consider valuable. So, when we look at that and we say, well, I'm concerned about knowledge retention, are we in fact thinking about what we mean by knowledge retention? Okay, that could in fact be a very limited definition of learning. Okay, where we say, well, 2 weeks from now, you'll be able to, pass a test, or 2 weeks from now, you'll be able to tell me like what you learned 2 weeks ago. So this idea of knowledge retention as a measurement of learning, I think is very limited and is really very simplistic. So that learning pyramid idea, again, it's one of those things that's been around for so long, but it's a myth. It is not based on research. It is not based on any kind of evidence about how people learn, unfortunately. Because really, wouldn't it be cool if it was true? I mean, that would be fabulous, right? You know, I could say, well, for all my instruction, I'm not going to have students read things. I'm going to have them engage in these other kinds of instruction, these other kinds of activities. And I know that they'll remember like 75% or they'll remember 90%. Wouldn't that be great if it were true? But it's not. Okay. So the question then becomes, why do we believe these myths? Well, I'm not surprised that a lot of people believe them because there aren't that many people who are familiar with research on teaching and learning. Now, somebody like me, that's the stuff I read for fun, right? So I don't expect that professors in any area other than education are going to read the kind of research that, you know, helps us to know if these things are true or not. So, you know, it's not a matter of, golly, you know, you must be kind of stupid if you believe that. That's not the case at all. In fact, it's simply because we're not familiar with the research about that. So it's not surprising, and it's not because people are stupid. Okay. So another reason we believe these things is that they are what I call intuitively attractive. And very often they're believable. So for example, this idea of, you know, visual learners, or, you know, the idea of the learning pyramid, right? We can look at that and we can say, you know, I like that, right? The learning pyramid, and we can look at that and know how much students are going to remember based on the instructional strategies. That sounds believable. And it's pretty cool if it's true. So there's a certain attractiveness to that, and certainly to looking at, you know, offering instruction based on a learning style. So for example, you know, we are told all the time that we should vary our instruction, that it shouldn't be all lecture, it shouldn't be all reading, it shouldn't be all one method or one particular kind of strategy. And that's true. We should vary that, but not based on someone's learning style, okay? And not based on what the learning pyramid says, okay? We should be doing that based on the learning outcomes, based on the kind of cognitive activity we want our students to engage in. You know, we want to think about the kind of thinking that we want them to do, and then give them practice at that. So the strategies that that we want to, you know, put into place as instructors aren't that easy, right? It isn't that easy to choose. So the idea that we could simply say, well, you know, these are visual learners, so I'm going to use a lot of visuals. That actually is pretty attractive, and it's a lot easier than doing the sort of hard work of figuring out what the most effective instructional methods are going to be. Another reason that we believe these things, they provide a simple answer to a complex problem or topic. Trust me, I love it when there's a simple answer, okay? So, you know, the learning pyramid is a good example of that. it says, oh, you want your students to learn a lot? Well, here's the kind of instruction you should be giving them. Bingo. Well, that's a pretty simple answer, right? So that is much, as I said, that's much easier than having to figure out, okay, this kind of learning that I want my students to engage in, this higher order thinking, that's difficult. That's difficult to elicit from our students, right? So give me a formula, right? You know, last year I taught a short course for the Faculty of Engineering at the University of Porto in Portugal, and I had several. I had a group of about 20 engineering professors take this course with me, and it was about engineering education. And so my students in the course, the professors, finally learned that when they would ask me a question about, you know, what they should do about a particular learning issue, or which was better, this or that, in terms of instructional strategies, eventually they figured out that the answer was probably going to be, well, it depends. Because in education, we're dealing with humans. And I think, you know, it's hard to do research and it's hard to do instruction when you're dealing with humans. Humans are unpredictable, irrational. There are all sorts of different competing priorities going on in our life. So being able to have a specific formula or procedure that we know is going to be effective, that just doesn't work. It just doesn't work. So these myths, because they seem to provide a simple answer, maybe not easy, but a simple, clean answer to something that ultimately is really pretty complex or messy, it makes them attractive. And then finally, these sort of myths might be compatible with things that we already believe, or even more likely, with things we've observed. So, you know, I think that many people will say, well, I know that learning styles are important because I know that I'm a visual learner. Well, most people identify themselves. In fact, this is one thing that's very interesting. When you ask people what kind of learner they are, if they believe in learning styles, they almost always say, I'm a visual learner. Well, in fact, we're all visual learners, right? And we're all auditory learners. And we all are reading learners, and we're all kinesthetic learners, okay? But in many cases, a teacher will say to me, well, I know many of my students are visual learners because, you know, I see that they pay closer attention if we're watching a video in class, right? And they pay closer attention to that than if I'm just lecturing, okay? So it fits with what we already believe, and it fits with things that we've observed. So in terms of this idea of these particular myths, please don't assume that within my presentation, I'm saying, golly, I can't believe you're believing all this stuff. That's just crazy. In fact, believing in these myths makes sense, right? I mean, they're not true, but it's not surprising at all. So what we have to do then is that we need to constantly question, and we need to think about whether this simple idea makes sense in this education world, which in fact doesn't have a lot of clean-cut black and white answers. Okay, so what I would like to do now is hear if there are any particular questions or comments. Maybe someone wants to tell me what kind of, that they are not a visual learner, but they're an auditory learner. So what questions or comments might we have? I see we have a comment box here, but I don't see anything in it.
Mom, actually, we live streamed this in YouTube, actually.
Ah, so I'm seeing.
There we have a lot of questions. We'll have few questions, Mom, actually.
Okay, and I'm not seeing any questions in the comments area.
But we got a question. Ma'am, the IQ of a student varies. How multitasking will affect for each individual? The IQ of a student varies. How multitasking will affect for each individual?
Okay, I'm not sure I heard that exactly. And it was regarding student multitasking.
Ma'am, but yes, but how if you consider in general, the IQ varies from person to person, ma'am. How it will affect on the multitasking?
So can you explain your question a bit more? Because I'm not. I guess I need to have a better sense of context or maybe an example.
On example means this is a question from one of our viewer, and
Okay.
he has asked that the IQ of a person will be different in means it will be varying between the person to person. On what context can he perform a multitasking operations? I think that is his question point. I guess it.
Okay, and I'm sorry, I'm having trouble hearing you.
Hello, ma'am.
Okay, I can hear you. And I'm sorry to ask you to repeat this one more time, but I think my audio was not good.
Ma'am, the question is, the IQ of the person will be vary from one person to other person, right?
Mhm.
Correct. How multitasking will affect the each and every individual? Because few people, they might have high IQs,
Mhm.
better IQs, and few people, they might have lesser IQs. How that IQ of a person will affect the multitasking process?
So, okay, wonderful. That's actually a wonderful question. So, yeah, looking at the variability in terms of IQ, what the research about multitasking indicates is that, in fact, because IQ has to do with simply the ability to process information, that in fact multitasking can be even worse for learners who are able to manipulate very complex information. And so what we see is that as they are attempting to multitask and to switch between, this task and another one and maybe a third one, that in fact what probably is happening is that because those tasks in fact take a lot of processing power, the effect of the multitasking is going to be even worse. So, if I'm doing very simple sorts of cognitive tasks. Maybe I'm just memorizing some information, or, I'm just trying to recall something. Maybe translating words. Those are fairly low level kinds of tasks cognitively. And so multitasking is going to interfere with that. But any kind of task that is more complex, multitasking is going to interfere with that even more. And so it's not so much that someone, has a high IQ, so they're good at multitasking because, they're probably no better than anyone else at it, but that in fact, the kind of thinking that they might be doing could be influenced in an even more negative way than someone who was, their cognitive processing was maybe at a lower level, which is not necessarily, and again, even low IQ people can think complex thoughts, and high IQ people can think very low, in a very low level thinking way. But as I said, if you are doing any higher order thinking, multitasking is going to have an even greater negative effect on you than doing sort of simple cognition. I hope that addresses your question.
Fantastic, ma'am. Absolutely, we got the answer, and we have one more question.
Is it possible to address all type of learners in a single class?
Is it possible to what?
Address all type of learners in a single class.
I'm so glad you asked that. So this comes back to that idea of, when people talk about learning styles, right? And how we should vary our instruction to address all of these different learning styles. That's not a bad idea. That's actually a really terrific idea, not because of the learning styles, but because varying the instruction is, ultimately, that's just a really good thing to do in terms of providing multiple opportunities for students to learn. Now, if I have a preference for visuals, I might find that for some kinds of tasks, for some sorts of content, in fact, visuals don't really help me a lot. So it's important for the instructor then to provide sort of multiple forms of content. And again, not because, well, I have some visual learners and I have some auditory learners, but because having these multiple representations simply provides another way for students to gain access to the content. And, we know that, being able to sort of receive information in a variety of ways helps us to embed that. So it's not so much about, gee, I really like visuals, but that we want to provide as many opportunities for learners to access the content. And so, simply saying, okay, I have, all visual learners in my class, let's say, or, people who think they're primarily a visual learner. So I'm going to just do all visual stuff, regardless of what we're talking about. Okay, that's not going to be helpful in many instructional situations. However, for any of the content we do, what we may say is, I think that this content can be described and can be explained to students in multiple ways. So I'm going to provide examples of those of that content in multiple formats, because sometimes if it's explained in pictures, I may get a certain kind of information from that. And then sometimes if I read, I'll pick up something else. And so it's important to vary the delivery because that just helps everybody, right? I mean, we talk about universal design for learning, and what we're saying is we want to provide as many opportunities to access the content as we can. You know, when we first started talking about universal design for learning and making our content accessible to as many people as possible, the focus was on people with disabilities. So someone who was hearing impaired or someone who was visually impaired. So we wanted to make sure the content was accessible to them. But interestingly, what happened was the research showed us that it helped everybody, right? I mean, preparing materials, videos with subtitles, in fact, helped all of the students, not just the students who were hearing impaired. So that's actually a very long way around of saying it's important to provide multiple means of accessing information. And it's not necessarily based on a particular learning style. So I think, yes, there's a way to do that. And the way to do that is to provide as many opportunities as we can for students to access the content.
Ma'am, we have a couple of questions. I think you can see in the chat comments. There's a private comments. Next to that, we have a comments, right? Private chat. Next to that, we have a comments. Can you see that?
Okay. Oh, here we go. Many are working from home. Okay. Shouldn't a home be a home and an office is a workplace? Oh my goodness. You know, this working from home idea. So it's a little, I'm probably not the best person to ask this question of, because one of the areas that I study and one of the areas that I've written about a lot is online learning. And we know that it doesn't, like, a lot of people like to say that, well, you know, you don't learn as much from a distance course, from an online course, whatever. In fact, that's not true. Students learn just as much in an online course as if they're sitting in a classroom. But I also recognize that things happen when we are all together, when we are physically in the same place, that psychologically I think are very important. So for example, being able to sort of develop that sense of belonging and that sense of knowing your classmates and feeling the community, that happens much more easily in a face-to-face environment. Now, it doesn't mean it can't happen in, you know, in an online situation, but that idea of sort of emotional investment and community building is much more difficult at a distance. And so I think, in fact, there are some very good reasons to learn together with others in the same place. And I think that's a really good reason to engage in blended learning, where we have some things online that work better online. So for example, a discussion board, right? That actually is great online. But then some activities work better face-to-face. And so thinking about how we spend our time face-to-face, I think is most definitely, you know, the best way to approach this, and not say, well, we're going to do everything online if we can, or we're not going to do everything face-to-face, because some things work better one way or the other. So yes, I think it is important for us to get back at some point to a place where we can sometimes be together with each other for learning. Let's see, the ideal strength of a class. I'm not sure I really understand. So Dr. Rashmi Shiva, okay, Shiva Rudraswamy. Shiva Rudraswamy, and I'm sorry, I'm mispronouncing your name. If you could explain your question a little bit more in a comment, I'll get back to it. How students should think, react to situations as they differ from one another in the way they work and do stuff. Okay. So the question about students having different reactions, you know, making different decisions in different situations. You know, this ultimately comes back to that ability to manipulate information. And so, you know, being able to think critically, to, you know, to take in content, but not only just have a lot of information, but know what to do with it. You know, we talk about the difference between experts and novices, and, you know, an expert doesn't just have more information, they actually think differently about that information. And so, you know, I think one thing we need to be doing is encouraging our students not just to get information, but to think about how they're manipulating it. What are they doing with that information? How can they apply it? Are they able to analyze? Are they able to compare things? Are they able to create things? Are they able to build an argument or justify a position? Those kinds of higher order thinking skills then, you know, will help them get to that point where, you know, they're not simply adding more content, but that they're thinking about it in much more complex and deeper ways. So I think that's one key that we need to remember as, you know, as we're sort of planning our instruction. Okay, let me cruise through the comments. Let's see. You know, I would, so the person who posted the question about, you know, shouldn't a home be a home and an office or a school be a school? So let's see, Adip Krishna Kilar. If you could you know, could put in a little comment about, you know, whether I actually, or whether you think that we should, you know, have some face-to-face time as well. You said, you know, that I answered your question, but I'd be interested in whether you see, whether you think it's important to keep those things separate.
I think Mom had answered all the questions.
Okay. Wonderful.
It was wonderful actually from our side, and it's a great opportunity to work with you actually, and it's very honored to have you on this occasion as a speaker on this digital and for education things. I request Mr. Gautam to give the proposed vote of thanks. Ma'am, any other suggestions to improve the quality of the education in India?
Pardon me?
Any suggestions or any technical suggestions to improve the quality of technical education?
You know, actually, I'm not even sure how to address that. You know, I think that one of the things that we're seeing in India and the United States and in Europe and, you know, in China, one of the things that we're seeing is that not enough people are going into STEM fields. You know, we don't see the diversity that we should be seeing in STEM fields, and we don't see as many young people going into those fields. I think making engineering education and other STEM fields inclusive, bringing in groups that are currently underrepresented, I think is absolutely critical for our future. And so, you know, that's actually, you know, one thing that I would say about sort of STEM education and engineering education in particular that we need to be focused on. And I think that's true in India as it is in many countries.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for providing this wonderful session. And I thank the for providing this opportunity. And I thank all the participants. And thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Well, I appreciate being invited. This has been wonderful.
And thank you. We're looking forward for the future collaboration.
Great, great. So the recording will be available at some point, or it's only streaming?
No, ma'am. I'll send you the link. No, ma'am. I'll send you the link.